destructuring for the win. Look, undoubtedly destructuring is one of like my favorite language features that JavaScript adopted post ES5. I think even AJ needs to admit that destructuring is cool.
Destructuring is not always evil, and thankfully it isn't cool. Because if it were cool, that would mean that it's unintuitive, not obvious, and it's only useful for bringing other people to show your screen, and not useful for committing to code. But destructuring can be useful. Now, most of the time, people don't use it in a useful way. Most of the time, they use it in a very cool way, where you have an entire deeply nested object on one side and an entirely deeply nested object on the other side, and you can't make any sense of what's going on. And then doing the renaming as well. That's the best part. When you deeply nest and rename at the same time, and you have it.
Here's the interesting thing.
Object on both sides.
Here's the interesting thing. I think that most JavaScript developers aren't actually even aware that you can do renaming like that. Unfortunately, though, if you rename symbols in like VS Code, it actually starts using that renaming capability, and that's kind of unfortunate. But we're kind of straying from the topic. The interesting thing is that you might have fallen into JSX kind of like by accident, but for example, Mishko and the guys from Quick were really intentional about it.
Yeah, no, that's true, and it's got to do with the time of stuff. I started Solid in 2016. React had begun to win at that point, but it wasn't like I was coming from somewhere older, like Knockout. It wasn't like I want to be like React in that sense. It was more like actually early days. I was just like, ugh, and like I didn't like the class components, like stuff like that just didn't sit right with me. And I think it is interesting that Quick initially, well, do you know why? It wasn't their goal. Quick was like, look, we need to handle data, like how to break up our app smaller, how to, get the hydration gone, essentially. Like, how do we do this? So for them, initially, the rendering part was like a second consideration. There's like what's the most popular pattern out there? Let's do that. Like, I think that wasn't the problem they were going to solve. We were actually chatting like, oh, maybe we can merge Solid's efforts with Quick. Like there's a couple things that are very clear to them. If you want to solve hydration, you need to use reactivity, because you need to know like what updates when, so you can basically separate the static part from the dynamic part. That's like, if you can do that, you can do resumability. It's like it's basically the foundation of the next, like kind of like sub-component hydration is, unsurprisingly, get away from the component model for change. So like, I think that's where the goals kind of made it kind of like, oh, this is good on that side. I think what's interesting with Quick is over the last year of using that model and playing with reactivity with JSX, how much more similar they are aligning and thinking with a lot of stuff that Solid does, because they're kind of like, oh, if I have these pieces together, oh, maybe there's a reason it works like this, right? But that wasn't really the goal there initially for them. It was all about like, how do we solve hydration and how do we make something that people would like to use? Whereas I didn't really care if anyone liked to use Solid, honestly. I was just like, I like fine-grained reactivity. I like this stuff. I didn't think anyone would. It was honestly, hooks were like a system shock to me. React's done this to me twice now, actually, because I was just like sitting there just doing my thing, running benchmarks, doing my reactive thing. Everyone's big on class components. Like, you got to go back to 2018. Vue was actually like, hey, we're going to add a class component mechanism. And like, they had proposals and all this kind of stuff. And then React's like hooks. And like, I didn't see that coming at all, admittedly, because like how
to give React, to give people the React team credit, they're not afraid of shaking things up and breaking stuff. I mean, obviously it's an interesting thing, because they need to support the Facebook or Meta code base. They always need to provide a reasonable way to migrate your code forward. But they were really brave, you might say, about shaking things up, like first of all moving from their create class to ES6 classes, and then introducing higher order components, and then throwing all this stuff away in favor of hooks. And like you said, in a lot of ways, nobody saw hooks coming. They kind of shocked everybody when they introduced it, almost to the same extent that they shocked everybody when they originally showed JSX.
Yep. Yeah. And for me, there was like a third shock factor was when I saw server components. I thought they would take the client model as far as forward as possible, but server components are very much rooted in a mechanically in a way that's very similar to multi-page apps and islands. So it was definitely, that was like, it was funny because I was working on Solid doing my thing, and they released hooks, and I'm like, oh my, really? So I that's why I started promoting Solid, because I was like, people might actually like this, but I didn't think anyone would like it when I was building it originally. I was just like, my thing. I'm a weirdo who still likes, when people get older, they become that like grumbly old man who's kind of like, oh,
Present.
back in the day we used to yeah, we used to do it like this. I felt that way about Solid to a large degree, because like the way I approached reactivity, everyone had already decided that wasn't what we were doing. So it's like, it's really weird to see like everyone embrace signals and stuff now, like the last year, between like, Quick and Preact and, even, it's just Angular's looking at them now too, of all things. But like, I did not see that coming, but that was where I kind of came up today. And then the second time I was working on the Marco team, working on islands and trying to work on the new stuff with the Marco team about how we could get partial hydration, to the next generation and, improve the tooling there. And React announces React Server components. And I was just like, what? Like, what do you guys like? So that is what brought the attention back to Marco and what triggered Astro and all that kind of stuff. I think is, again, we talked about big movers shining a light on things. These technologies existed before. I mentioned Marco had some version of partial hydration and was out of order streaming going back to like 2014. But like, the truth of the matter is, if it's not what people know they need or whatever, it's very hard to kind of push that forward. React was like, yes, we're looking at partial hydration, we're looking at out of order streaming, and then suddenly, again, for the second time, found myself in a very interesting position.
Amusingly, I had some misunderstandings and misconceptions about React server components when they were initially introduced. In fact, if people go back to my episodes about understanding React, I actually even explained certain things wrong there. I assumed that the server components were effectively just going to be VDOM over the wire, and I thought that it was going to work both ways, that you would literally be able to interact with this sort of a generic component on the client side. They would serialize the event, send it over the wire to be handled server side, and then send down the resulting VDOM over the wire. And that's not exactly what they do, obviously. Server components can't really handle client side events. You need to embed client components within the server components in order to do that. The other thing that I didn't kind of see coming is that they would embrace a totally different model for a synchronicity in the server components, that you could and probably should make server components async, whereas client-side component obviously aren't. And by the way, that's also kind of my biggest issue with it, is the fact that you have a totally distinct model for asynchronicity for both these types of components. So you can't, it's kind of like going back to those days of having stateful class components versus stateless functional components, and they don't mix very well together. It's kind of like, feels like that to me all over again, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, it is a tricky problem to solve, because you build your whole framework thinking client side, right? Like that's the approach, right? Even early suspense, maybe streaming was considered there, but it's the isomorphic model. All your code is going to run on the client and server except maybe a few little things that run only on the server. So get server-side props or whatever. Like you annotate the stuff that runs on the server. That's the kind of client-side isomorphic thing. You annotate the things that run on the server only, but most things you're expecting to run on both sides. That's how SSR works today. That's basically the kind of single-page app model. Server components kind of flip it around again, where they're like, actually, and this is like multi-page apps and islands, most of your stuff, the core of your app is actually running on the server, and then we're going to denote the things, opposite. We're going to denote the things that run in the client as well. So we're actually shrinking the size of the isomorphic code. We're actually creating more server-only code and being very strict about that. And I think that's an interesting shift because, like, in the end, even though you can try and offer the same syntax, or maybe same, there are rules there, and more or less you're creating a new framework around an old framework, which is really interesting juxtaposition when you look at something like Astro or an Islands, which literally is a new framework wrapping old frameworks. Like there's a lot of similarities there when you actually look at it. Like I thought that too. When I first saw server components, I was like, oh, so this is like an API request for serialized JSX. So it's like it's funny. There's a conversation I was in last week where we joked and called those lakes. Like essentially, you have a client app, and then you go ask for some server stuff. It's like the opposite of islands, but that's not actually what happens. Server components, the root of the app is basically a server component that has kind of client components woven through it. You can pass server data, like children, to client components, but essentially you have these kind of interwoven trees, but the experience starts on the server from a server root, very much like an Islands experience.
Almost, not totally, because it's still mostly in SPA, which means it does start on the client in the client-side router, and then it goes to the server-side component. It's kind of odd that way.
I mean, the thing is, the pure React server components mechanism is kind of set up that way, where it's like, well, how should I put this? Because in practice, almost any framework that's adopted React server components has combined it with SSR, and it's not always obvious to people what the difference is, because with server components, you have the server components themselves, which are the things that always run on the server. And then you have the client components, which are like these islands, right? And in pure server component lands, those islands...
You need to be explicit about it. You've got server components which only run on the server, and you've got client components which run both on the server and the client.
Right. But the thing is, the original way they demoed it was that the client components only ran on the client. Because like after initial render, this is true. So they demoed it by making a client-side app, which then like requested for the server page and then wove the client stuff in. Every actual framework actually SSRs the initial render so that the server components and the client components render the initial page on the server. So that's why it's kind of confusing, because the structure of the app when you're authoring looks like the server components are the root of the app, because like the HTML header, like the like the body, like the outside the body tag, like that's all server component, and then usually you inject the client components in. But like the actual spec underneath and the actual way they're being used in frameworks is like a tiny bit different, and it influenced actually. It's funny, like the React server components is like a generalized approach, whereas people who are attacking this today from the Islands perspective, trying to add similar capability, like myself, we didn't view it that way. But you're right, I'm not being probably clear enough of what I mean by that. Let me think of how I can. In an MPA, like Islands, as you said, server code only runs on the server, client code runs on both sides. You render it on the server, and then it hydrates on the client, just those client islands. But when you go to the next page in an MPA Islands framework thing, you throw away that current page, get the new page, and start all over again. In a server components setup, after that initial load, which is effectively like the Islands framework, where you render the client and server at the same time, when you go to the next navigation, it doesn't matter if you have the same islands or you have new islands. The server only renders the server components, and the client only renders the client components. The reason for this, as you can kind of figure out if you think about it for a moment, is that context, shared state, needs to exist in the client. So once you've loaded that initial page, and let's say you put some kind of context provider at the top of the page, like a counter, you click it like 10 times, and now your count's at 10. The server has no way of knowing of the updated state in the client when it goes to server render the next page. That next page might use a client component that reads from that shared context. So the only like reasonable way to handle that is actually don't render the client components on the server afterwards. This is going to be a fun thing for people to kind of realize as they start working through using these kind of patterns, that there are these kind of different rules and things running at the same time. But I actually, I wasn't 100% sure of this myself. A week ago, I was on stream and I was like, let's just try this and see what happens. Put some console logs, trying to wrap our heads around this. And that's what I discovered.
All I know is that we're going to start recognizing modern apps by having a million tiny spinners instead of one big one.
Well, that's why they created suspense.
Yeah,
Like,
but I mean,
like-
it kind of ties to this whole server component thing, because you're going to go back to the server. In the interim, you're going to put a spinner there. So
Yes.
yeah, it needs to be a suspense boundary, but that's just the suspense boundaries are React technicalities of how they implement this whole thing.
Big question. What does any of this actually gain us? Why are we doing all of this?
Okay, fair enough.
It's just complexity upon complexity upon complexity. We're dealing with people that are coming out of boot camps that is the majority of developers. How is anybody ever going to be able to reason about just? I mean, if we just went back to Rails, at least websites would work again.
Right, and that is the question there, because there is two things here. The first is there is a hope. Okay, sorry. Actually, the first thing is that the performance thing. This does lend to less JavaScript execution in the browser and load. It does shrink our bundle size. Server components, in a Next app might still come out at 90 kilobytes. And if you have code splitting on your page, like I get that you might not feel like you're getting the win.
I have to push back on this a little bit to an extent. From my perspective, it's like this. For the majority of the types of websites that most people build, this is excessive complexity, okay? But you need to remember that React is built for the meta use case. It needs to be able to support something like meta. So Meta cannot produce a framework that doesn't support their own use case. So obviously, it's going to be something of an overkill for a lot of the simpler use cases. At least that's my perspective.
Well, I mean, okay, I guess it depends. Do we think that using something like Astro is complicated? Like, I mean, maybe it is, but for me, I just put out there, Astro, you come in, you author an HTML file, and then at a certain point, you decide to add some client interactivity. So you bring in a React component you have, or a Preact component, or Svelte, or whatever, and then that's your website.
So,
and that works great as long as you don't need to share state between components.
Which one is Astro? Is that the one that's like a more modern jQuery? Because there's so many now. We're experiencing another explosion.
We had Fred on the show. Actually, I didn't because I wasn't there on that episode. But like Astro is an interesting take on meta frameworks. It's multi-page applications. It's framework agnostic, and it simplifies the simple use case. So if you're building a website, they like to call it primarily content sites, and which are mostly not interactive, you can like forget about a lot of the complexity that's associated with the other frameworks, but you pay for it when you do need to create something that's more sophisticated.
Right.
Okay, I was getting confused with Alpine for a second.
Yeah. And the reason I ask this question is because the reason, the goal here is this. like you mentioned the shared state for Astro. Yeah, that is tricky, both on the MPA navigation side because you lose that state, and it's also tricky because like how do you share between client components? The truth of the matter is, even with Astro's model, you could have the islands talking to each other using something like React's provider pattern. I'm like, it is completely doable to, if that was a pattern you want.
Oh,
you can
it's
also just
doable.
make
The DOM's there, JavaScript's there, the window object is there. Obviously, you can share stuff, but
right. Yeah, but I mean, like, it depends. I guess it is React when it was first introduced too complicated. Maybe that is still the thing. But where I was trying to get here is that there's the performance aspect, which is the first half, right? Which is like, yes, we are reducing it. But the second part is, this is a very MPA like mentality in terms of how you approach authoring, which is why I brought up Astro. It's because like you go in, you build a page. Like I'm not talking about Nexus specific implementation or like what we've seen so far, but conceptually you could see that you could go in, build a page, and then add client interactivity to it the way Astro does, and then have client side routing essentially, which would preserve the state between, like, as long as you defined a way to say, here is a state container, like I use context as an example, you could basically have this authoring experience where for a simple app, you could build something like an MPA. You'd be like, here's my HTML, here's my page, it doesn't do anything. And then you could add these islands on top of it. And in both cases, it just does client-side routing, and like you kind of get an experience that looks kind of like single-page apps today, except you're not shipping the JavaScript. That's what the hope is. But yes, right now it seems like a lot of complexity. But I think we're looking into it because there's this thinking, and I do kind of agree on this, that the potential of these patterns could simplify beyond what we do with single page apps today. But maybe that's too optimistic, because any kind of MPA type pattern doesn't take into consideration client-side caching. And that's probably one of the most complicated topics, like basically the client-side state management in single page apps today. So this is definitely like a pendulum swing this way, swing further back this way, swing back in the middle kind of situation.
And I'll be blunt. If you want to get away from complexity, just build your site on Wix. You don't have to build it in JavaScript and DOM manipulations and whatnot.
Yes.
Well, but what if I still want to build my website?
Well, we had Yoav on to explain that you could with Wix, but that's not the point here. There are box solutions for something like 80 to 90% of what most web developers do, be it Wix or WordPress or Shopify or whatever. And so the frameworks need to enable the more sophisticated use cases. Otherwise, what's the point?
Yes, man, it is tricky because, I mean, this does come down to the question, should we be looking for one solution for everything? That's what this all boils down to. And it is very obvious to be like, no, like there's tools for the job, right? But every time on the web, when we get to a certain point, we ask ourselves that question. It just comes up. You're like, oh, I'm the dominant player. It happened with .NET and Java time period when they started getting into, and they started getting into like how they could like merge the client and server model. We're doing it again here. Where we're like, why can't sites and apps be used and built with the same tools?
Yeah, let's go back to that Astro scenario. Let's say I believe in using the best tool for the job, and I'm saying, okay, I'm building a content website. It's just a content website with very little interactivity. I'll build it with Astro, and I get excellent performance scores, and the process is really streamlined and easy, and it's all great. But then I keep adding functionality into the site. So is there like a point in time where I say, okay, I've reached a certain point where I've reached a certain amount of complexity, I'm going to throw away my entire implementation and rewrite it using some other framework? Well, likely that's not going to happen. Instead, I'm going to keep on adding stuff into the existing implementation, and then bitch and moan about the fact that I'm hitting Astro's limitations.
Yeah, and that's that's probably the motivation why people are looking at scaling that stuff. Like, in a sense, like what if you could take a certain model and it could scale across that range. That's I feel like both Quick and server components are approaches trying to answer that question in slightly different ways, but but like both of them probably start, at least today, at a higher level of complexity before, like it doesn't appeal to the person who come in and make an Astro site. But I'm not sure that has to be the case. Like, what if your Astro site could have could do what server components do? Like that's something very interesting to me, actually. And a lot of my research recently has been looking at how agnostic we can get solutions like this. I actually fairly confident if Astro so chose, they could get into that kind of solution if they wanted. It's interesting because
we've been running for a long time. I think we do need to start wrapping it up. So I would like to throw one more question. And that question is, so based on everything you said, who's going to win? Like, which framework should I learn if I want to have a job in 2023, 2024, and going forward? Because I have to point out that just like a few days ago, Toby Lotke, Shopify CEO, tweeted that it looks like a Remix is going to win the framework competition. So, we've got that position out.
He's also involved in actually buying Remix.
No,
right?
obviously, he's the one that gave pulled out the wallet.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, that's not a terribly surprising take then. Yeah. I mean, it's okay. Short term, stuff built on React is still definitely that's a sure bet. It's harder to say how long term if that shifts, but you can't go wrong with IBM or whatever. Like you can't go wrong with React to a certain degree. It's going to stay being the thing. I think that mentality is getting more annoying by the day from my perspective. But I will say that I think that it's very easy to kind of point at that. There's what I'm interested in is I think everyone from React to all these new solutions are actually making significant progress in these places. It's just when the comparison changes to the metrics or the areas where these new solutions are highlighted, I think it's a much more interesting choice than today, because I do think it's not just UX of performance. I think there's DX considerations here. I do think the reason I brought up Astro, for example, is where Astro is a winner. It for me, at least personally, it feels like a clear winner. And I think there's going to be a lot of it's funny. We're talking, the last year is all about performance and innovation in terms of technology, but it's going to flip back on DX very quickly here. Right now we're at a point where look, these technologies are possible, but using them is kind of horrendous. And I think maybe at that point there is going to be a bit of a shift when you put both of those elements together, where people are going to start asking, why do I want this complexity? And it's perceived complexity. The actual solution might be complex, but why do I want this complexity? And when I make my blog site, I get X performance. And I think that's where the conversation is probably.
I need to point out two important points here. One is that only 30-something% of all React sites actually have good performance. And that's skewed by the fact that Wix sites are actually React sites, and Wix is pulling the React statistics up. Because
yes.
So in actuality, if you look at Next.js, something like only 20% of Next.js websites actually have good performance. Now this might change when everybody embraces server components. Time will tell. But that's the way it currently is. And the second thing, which goes exactly to your point, and also to the point that AJ was making before, when we start using server components, we are adding complexity not removing complexity, because we still have the quote unquote client components that we had before. So we had everything we had before, and now we also have server components.
Yep, it's another layer. It's funny. We'll have to see how it shifts. I find whenever these abstractions or these layers kind of happen, certain things just fall by the wayside. I think that's the other thing everyone has to be prepared for here. A lot of these innovations right now are ecosystem threatening, and we're actually like at the beginning of kind of testing the waters on that, right? Like, yes, you have what you had before with the JavaScript thing, but the departure of, say, server component type architecture from what we do today completely changes the story around like data fetching libraries and like a lot of the state libraries and how they play into it. So like, I think it's actually really interesting is that like maybe 30%, 50% of React libraries just stop actually having a reason to exist.
You're basically saying that once I have server components, I don't need a state management library anymore. And not only that, my state management becomes type safe. Those are undoubtedly big wins, for sure.
Right. And then the other side of it is if I'm going to embrace reactivity to such a degree to solve, these hydrations or whatever, like mechanical kind of things like Vue and Vue Vapor, suddenly like, again, Vue Vapor is a new compiler that the Vue team is kind of like looking at, very similar to what Solid outputs. It's not exactly compatible with Vue today. Like you can put Vapor leaves inside your Vue app, but it's not like the same. It's a different render model. It's a different thing. So I think people are right now taking that opportunity, watching React kind of like make this shift and go, okay, now's a good time to like pull our shifts as well, because things are kind of like shaky and we can take risks right now. So I'm looking at it like just looking at the whole ecosystem. I'm looking at like a bunch of shakeups this next year between the progression of people trying to hunt after like DX to kind of win points on basically features everyone's working on, and like combating that with like a almost like ecosystem resetting level of change.
Certainly gives new meaning to the term vaporware, doesn't it? Okay, so with that, I'm going to start wrapping us up and head towards picks. Thanks, Ryan, for coming on. Real quick before I forget, if people want to follow you and give you money or anything, read what you're working on, where's the best places to do that?
Yeah, I mean, everything is either linked off my Twitter, which is at Ryan Carniato, spelled Carniato, or the SolidJS website. You'll have links there to my YouTube channel where I stream videos weekly, Discord, where the community around Solid is, my Dev2, where I write articles. So all that content is there. I honestly would just start with Twitter.
And I would like to say that the amount of great content that you put out I find it fairly astounding. The fact that you can do all that and still advance Solid is good for you.
Thank you. It takes a lot of time, but one of the coolest things that I found is you can kind of do learning while you're building that content, and that's usually how I position it. I'm like, I need to look into this for Solid's sake, and then I make content around it while I do it. So kind of hit two birds with one stone to some degree. So I'm glad it's helping others as well, though.
Sort of, I think the phrase is learning in the open.
Yeah. Or learn in public, I think. Yeah,
something along those lines. All right, so we'll move on to picks. I will start out today. And before I get to the high point of any podcast, the dad jokes of the week, found an interesting post I was actually reading before we started recording today, and it sort of interestingly fit in with some of the things that we were talking about. It's written by a guy named Eric W. Bailey, and it talks about how we develop websites can actually hinder people when they're trying to find information. And his example has to do with a mental health website called Modern Health, and how he goes to that website and gets a white screen of death with a little spinner in the middle. And he talks about how they've over-engineered it with React and Webpack. And so you get somebody who's really in need of some help. They're having a mental health issue, and they go to the website and they can't access any of the resources. So seems sort of apropos considering the topics that we are discussing today. So we'll have a link in the show notes. Definitely a timely article. And now for the dad jokes of the week. I had them all bookmarked and then I lost them all again. So let me find them real quick. So tonight for dinner, my wife told me that we are going to have some Himalayan rabbit stew. Sounds pretty eloquent or exquisite, but it just means we found Himalayan in the road.
Oh.
Right. Yesterday, I went to the mail and I opened my electric bill and my water bill at the same time. Needless to say, I got quite a shock.
Yeah.
Right. And then last week I went to the doctor's office and he came in because I'd had done some tests, and he came in and said, "I have your test results." I said, "Did I pass?" He said, "You will."
Ooh.
Those are the dad jokes of the week. Dan, what do you have for us?
Well, it's a good thing that you put the humor up first, because my pick, not actually a pick so much as, again, an observation, is not a pleasant one for me. I usually avoid talking about politics in general and politics in Israel in particular, but this is a fairly unfortunate time in Israel and it's got me pretty depressed, I have to say. We have a new government, and this government is pushing through a set of laws which are intended to eliminate the independence of the courts. So basically, the government will be able to select judges and overrule judges' decisions, and effectively eliminate the separation that's kind of inherent in democracies between the three different branches: the executive, legislature, and how do you say it?
Judiciary. The judicial.
Yeah, exactly. So they're kind of, and so obviously, happily, a lot of Israelis are objecting to that, which has led to a wave of really large protests and demonstrations. I literally participate in one every week. We had a big one today because they pushed through the first batch, the initial draft of the first batch of these laws, but so far they aren't stopping. And it looks like until we have something that's kind of like major civil unrest, this is not going to change. So hopefully it doesn't end up in anything more than that. You know, who wants to see fighting in the streets? But it's really not, Israel is not in a good place. Let's put it this way.
And I'm guessing they probably named the bill something like "Greater Separation of Judiciary Branch."
Exactly. The people have spoken. Let the people decide what they want. You know, if you're familiar with the term of the dictatorship of the majority. And in this case, it's not even exactly a majority. It's roughly half the population. It's kind of like a winner take all, not to the same extent that you have in the States, but you have a situation in which half the population is kind of like trying to force its let's call it ideals, its point of view on the rest, and trying to eliminate the courts as a check and a limitation on what they can do. So yeah, it's quite Orwellian.
Yeah, absolutely dystopian.
Sounds like politics here in Oregon too.
Yeah, but it's kind of different when it's on at the national level.
All right, is that your only pick, Dan?
Yeah, that and the ongoing war in Ukraine, if we want to be totally depressed. Yeah, those are my picks for today.
Thank you for that cheerful note. AJ, on to you.
Okay, so I'm going to do the self-promo section first. So we're talking about writing another language earlier and how that's such a bad idea. So I am now in earnest working on AI script, and the I is a swash letter I when stylized properly. So it looks like a J, but it's actually an I. And that's how I reconcile the AJ script, AI script debate, is that it's a swash letter I. So the feature of this language that makes it different from every other language is type drafting, which this is a term that invented itself and that it makes perfect sense. So type drafting is that as you write the code, the type annotations are added and updated while you update the code. And as long as you don't do something that is in violation of the language's type system, no matter how stupid or idiotic or whatever it may appear to be, it will update the type annotations to be what you have done. And this gives you the benefit of being able to see what you did versus what you thought you did. And then when you finalize the types, then it works in the other direction. So while you're type drafting, your types are being updated from the actual reality of your code. And then when you're done type drafting, then any changes you make to the code are checked against the types that you have confirmed and validated. The other interesting feature of this language is that, well, it runs in browsers and in runtimes like Node.js without any transpiling. But it is kind of like how we were talking about the semantics of the language are different, but the outcomes are the same. Meaning, so for example, I'll give you one example. The language has variable shadowing, which is something that a lot of modern languages have, which is where you're not allowed to change the type of a variable. So if I say the type of this variable is a string, so let's say I get an age from some user input, and when I get that, the user typed it as a string, so it's the string 18. But I want to parse that into a number. If I were to do age equals parse int age, this would actually be an error to assign a string a number. This is an error. This is not allowed. But if I were to do var age equals parse int age, comma 10, that is allowed because I am declaring this variable is being shadowed. So I declared the variable once, and then the second, what looks like a declaration, well, what is a declaration, is the shadowing of the variable. So at that point, I'm allowed to assign a new variable of the same name to a different type, and I can't access the previous variable anymore. There's also a lot of things that this language has that are, that it doesn't have. There's no prototypes, there's no this, there's no switch. I'm looking at right now, the number of keywords in the language is about 24, which would make it one of the smallest languages in existence, something that you could literally learn in a weekend. So anyway, that's my announcement of AI script. Obviously, you can't use it yet. It is being spec'd and tools are being developed. I am working with someone who is a world-class language designer that has actually worked on one of the prominent TypeScript tools to try to get this put together in a way that I would not be able to do it by myself. But I'm excited about this. I've wanted this for a long time. I've been really, for the past couple of years, or at least the past year, because I don't know if it's actually been a full 2 years that I've been using the TypeScript checker, but I've had such a love-hate relationship with it, and I've just really wanted tools that work great in native browser code, and this language, I think, will fit the bill. And one day, it could expand to be big enough that the macro system for the language could also work with JavaScript. But as of right now, it is its own distinct, separate language that is not compatible with JavaScript, but it is compatible with browsers and runtimes. So that out of the way, I have 2 short picks. One is, if you haven't heard about ChatGPT Dan, it's a role play model that you can do with ChatGPT to get it to go beyond the stupid, this is a subject that blah, 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 blah. I can't respond. I'm an AI, blah, blah, blah.
Wait a minute. ChatGPT Dan isn't an AI version of me?
Well, I'm not sure whether it's an AI version of you. I think it kind of is because it's not as intelligent as you, but it's more intelligent than ChatGPT is typically.
Yeah, I saw this. This is awesome.
So wait a minute,
Yeah,
it does work or it doesn't work? It's real or a myth?
It is real. So I'm linking to the second video, the part 2 video, because in the part 1 video, I debunked it as a hoax. There's a couple things that you need to do to get it to work. One of which may be to clear out all of your browser data and cookies for the ChatGPT site, because if there's old data in the browser, it may not be able to engage in that mode.
Wait a minute,
And
clear
another
out
thing
all
is
the
I've linked-
cookies? Like, what are we, in the 90s? What, like...
This is what you got to do for web development, Dan. Not all the cookies of the entire browser. Clear it out of that page. Get rid of the state. Get rid of the state entirely.
It's like those old days in
that
Amazon.
page.
If you wanted the discount, you would clear your cookies.
That's how the web still works, Dan. Have you not used Amazon recently? I mean, that's how the web still works. All of that is still the same.
Yeah, now it's just on a huge JavaScript framework and meta framework and whatnot, but it's still cookies all the way down.
Yeah. So anyway, you have to use a specific script, and the script will only work for so long, and then the ChatGPT catches on to the fact that you're getting it to go against the content policy or something, and then it kind of boots you out, and you got to redo it again. But the second video is where, because people were getting so angry in the comments at me that it's not a hoax, it's real, but nobody would provide me with the script that actually works. Then finally somebody did. You know, because they're just saying, oh, you just have the outdated script. That's why. And I'm like, okay, sounds like a hoax. I mean, you can hit Control-Shift-5 just as good as I can, can't you? So, and on Windows, that's, sorry, I meant Command-Shift-5. On Windows, it's Control-Alt-R to do a screen cap. Anyway, but so, and then somebody came out with the anti-Dan, and they have not released the script for it, but the anti-Dan is, as you would expect, a more restricted ChatGPT, where no matter what you ask it, it tells you that it's insensitive, can cause mental harm, goes against the content policy,
By the way,
debatable information.
AJ, have you seen Cat GPT?
No, I have not.
Well, you should. If you're worried about being offended, then Cat GPT is the one for you.
All right. Well, I am.
Just search for it.
I wasted so much time on
GPT.
The first
Check
one.
it out. You like it.
Okay, I will give it a brief check, but I got sucked down the ChatGPT Dan rabbit hole, and it sucked some hours of my life I'm not going to get back, so I don't want to get too stuck in that again. But if you're interested in watching the video where I debunk my debunking to show that it is not a hoax, that video will be linked, as well as the anti-Dan comments. And that's it.
I like
that's
things
what
that
I
are
got for the week.
anti-Dan.
Good.
Alrighty,
It's in
Ryan,
the chat right now if you want to check it out.
your turn, Ryan. What do you got for us for picks?
Yeah, I mean, this week, it's pretty timely. The React documentary came out. I know JavaScript framework thing, but I actually quite enjoyed that. A lot of history, a lot of memories. So yeah, I definitely recommend checking that out if you have any interest there. It covers the period of React basically before the modern period. It like kind of the video ends around 2015.
I have to say, by the way, is that I was kind of I didn't expect it, but I was, despite it, slightly disappointed that they didn't mention Wix. And the reason that I bring Wix up in this context is that Wix actually embraced React back in 2014. And I think that Wix was like one of the biggest, if not the biggest, implementation of React outside of Meta/Facebook way back when. And even to this day, 20% of all React websites, according to the Chrome User Experience Report, are actually Wix websites. So a huge portion of all React websites are actually Wix websites. And I think that the Wix viewer might still be like the most complicated React application out there. The Wix editor, sorry, is still one of the most complex React applications out there. It's huge.
Alrighty, we have been going way long on this. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you, Ryan, for coming on to the podcast, so subjecting yourself, sharing your knowledge and experience with us. As he said, if you want any more information about him and his knowledge, Ryan Carniato on Twitter. So with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll talk at you next time on JavaScript Jabber.
Bye.